Have you ever wondered why one of history's most brilliant minds spent decades studying the female psyche, only to admit he was utterly baffled by what women truly want? Picture this: Sigmund Freud, the man who revolutionized our understanding of human psychology, the father of psychoanalysis who could decode the deepest corners of the human mind, sitting in his study, surrounded by cigar smoke and case files, penning one of the most honest confessions in scientific history. The great question that has never been answered, and which I have not yet been able to answer despite my 30 years of research into the feminine soul, is: what does a woman want? This wasn't just intellectual curiosity speaking. This was a man who had built his entire career on understanding human desire, admitting defeat when it came to half the human population. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. Freud didn't just struggle to understand female desire. His theories about it would go on to shape how society viewed women for over a century, and some of those ideas still influence us today in ways we don't even realize. Imagine living in an era where your deepest desires, your most intimate feelings, were being analyzed and categorized by someone who openly admitted he couldn't understand them. That was the reality for women in Freud's time. And the ripple effects of his confusion continue to impact relationships, self-perception, and even medical treatment of women today. Freud's journey into the female psyche began with his most famous patient, Anna O, whose real name was Bertha Pappenheim. She came to him with what was then called hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis that was essentially code for "we don't understand what's wrong with this woman." Anna O suffered from paralysis, hallucinations, and what we might now recognize as symptoms of trauma or dissociation. But here's the fascinating part. She seemed to get better simply by talking about her experiences. She called it the talking cure, and this became the foundation of psychoanalysis. But as Freud delved deeper into Anna O's case and others like it, he began to develop theories that would become increasingly controversial. He started to believe that much of female psychological distress stemmed from what he called penis envy, the idea that women were fundamentally dissatisfied with their biological reality and secretly wished to be men. This wasn't just a clinical observation, it became a cornerstone of his understanding of female psychology. The implications were staggering. According to Freud, women's desires weren't just different from men's, they were fundamentally flawed, rooted in a sense of biological inadequacy. He suggested that normal female development required women to transfer their sexual desires from their mothers to their fathers and then to other men in a complex psychological dance that he admitted he couldn't fully comprehend. But here's where Freud's story takes an even more intriguing turn. Despite his theories about penis envy and female inferiority, he was surrounded by brilliant women who challenged his ideas at every turn. His daughter Anna Freud became a pioneering psychoanalyst in her own right. His patients often presented him with evidence that contradicted his theories. Other female analysts in his circle, like Helene Deutsch and Karen Horney, began to push back against his ideas about female psychology. The cognitive dissonance was palpable. Freud was witnessing female intelligence, creativity, and desire firsthand, yet his theories suggested that women were somehow psychologically incomplete. This contradiction would haunt his work for decades and create a legacy that psychology is still grappling with today. Consider the women who sought Freud's help. They weren't just suffering from mysterious ailments, they were often brilliant, creative individuals trapped in a society that had very narrow expectations for their gender. Take Dora, another of Freud's famous cases. She was a young woman who had been sexually propositioned by an older family friend, and when she rejected his advances and told her father she was the one who ended up in therapy, Freud's analysis of her case reveals as much about the social constraints of the time as it does about his psychological theories. Dora's story is particularly unsettling because it highlights how Freud's confusion about female desire often led him to dismiss women's own accounts of their experiences. When Dora insisted that she genuinely wasn't interested in the older man who had propositioned her, Freud suggested that she was repressing her true feelings. When she expressed anger about being treated as a pawn in the adult's complicated relationships, he interpreted this as a sign of her psychological disturbance rather than a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. This pattern repeated throughout Freud's career. Women would come to him with stories of trauma, abuse, or simply the frustration of living in a restrictive society, and he would often reinterpret their experiences through the lens of his theories about female psychology. Their anger became penis envy. Their depression became a failure to properly navigate their Oedipal complex. Their creative ambitions became sublimated sexual desires. The most chilling aspect of this dynamic was how it created a circular logic that was almost impossible to escape. If a woman agreed with Freud's interpretation of her psyche, it confirmed his theories. If she disagreed, that disagreement was itself seen as evidence of her psychological resistance or repression. It was a system that made women's own understanding of their desires and experiences essentially irrelevant. But perhaps the most unsettling truth about Freud's approach to female desire is how it reflected and reinforced broader cultural anxieties about women's changing roles in society. This was the late 19th and early 20th century, a time when women were beginning to demand political rights, educational opportunities, and greater autonomy. The idea that female desire was fundamentally mysterious and possibly dangerous served to justify continued restrictions on women's freedom. Freud's famous question, "What does a woman want?" wasn't just an intellectual puzzle. It was a reflection of a society that was deeply uncomfortable with the possibility that women might want the same things men wanted: power, recognition, sexual agency, and self-determination. By framing female desire as inherently mysterious and potentially pathological, Freud's theories provided a pseudoscientific justification for maintaining traditional gender roles. The emotional impact of this approach on the women who encountered it cannot be overstated. Imagine being told that your deepest feelings and desires were symptoms of psychological dysfunction. Imagine having your anger dismissed as penis envy, your ambitions pathologized as sublimated sexuality, your very sense of self questioned by an authority figure who claimed to understand you better than you understood yourself. This brings us to one of the most profound questions raised by Freud's work. How do we understand and validate human desire, particularly when it challenges existing social structures? Freud's confusion about female desire reveals something important about the limitations of any psychological theory that doesn't take into account the social and political context in which that desire exists. The women in Freud's case studies weren't just individual patients with individual problems. They were representatives of an entire gender that was struggling to define itself in a rapidly changing world. Their desires for education, for career fulfillment, for sexual agency, for political participation weren't mysterious or pathological. They were natural responses to expanding possibilities and continuing restrictions. Yet Freud's influence extended far beyond his consulting room. His theories about female psychology became embedded in medical education, legal systems, and popular culture. For decades, women seeking medical help for physical symptoms were told their problems were all in their heads, a direct descendant of Freud's hysteria diagnosis. Women's testimony in legal proceedings was questioned based on assumptions about female psychology that traced back to Freudian theory. Even today, women's pain is often dismissed or minimized by medical professionals who have been trained in systems that still bear traces of these historical biases. The story becomes even more complex when we consider that Freud wasn't entirely wrong about everything. His recognition that unconscious desires and early experiences shape adult behavior was revolutionary. His insight that sexuality is a fundamental aspect of human psychology was groundbreaking. His development of the talking cure created the foundation for modern psychotherapy. The problem wasn't that all of his ideas were worthless. It was that his blind spots about gender created a distorted lens through which he viewed half of humanity. This is why understanding Freud's struggle with female desire is so crucial for anyone trying to understand human psychology today. It's not just a historical curiosity, it's a cautionary tale about what happens when brilliant minds operate within the constraints of their cultural moment without sufficient self-awareness about those constraints. As we reach the midpoint of this exploration, it's worth pausing to consider how these ideas have shaped your own understanding of desire, gender, and psychology. The influence of Freudian thought is so pervasive that most of us carry traces of these ideas without even realizing it. If you're finding this journey through the complexities of psychological history as fascinating as I am, and you want to dive deeper into how these foundational ideas continue to shape our world today, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Trust me, the second part of this story will challenge everything you thought you knew about the relationship between psychology, power, and human understanding. The second part of Freud's story with female desire becomes even more intriguing when we examine what happened to his theories as they encountered the real world. While Freud was developing his ideas in his Vienna consulting room, women across Europe and America were living lives that directly contradicted his assumptions about female psychology. They were becoming doctors, lawyers, writers, and activists. They were demanding the vote, starting businesses, and creating art that challenged conventional notions of femininity. This contradiction created a fascinating dynamic within the psychoanalytic movement itself. Many of the most brilliant early psychoanalysts were women who had been drawn to Freud's revolutionary ideas about the unconscious mind, but who found themselves in the awkward position of having to defend or modify theories that essentially pathologized their own gender. The result was a rich and complex debate that continues to influence psychology today. Karen Horney, one of the most prominent female analysts of the early 20th century, directly challenged Freud's concept of penis envy. She argued that if women sometimes felt envious of men's social position, it wasn't because of biological inadequacy, but because of genuine social inequality. She proposed that men might equally experience womb envy, a concept that seems almost laughably obvious now but was revolutionary at the time. Horney's work highlighted how Freud's theories might be more about male anxiety than female psychology. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Freud's legacy regarding female desire is how it created a template for dismissing women's own accounts of their experiences. This pattern, where women's self-reported feelings and desires are reinterpreted by male authorities as symptoms of psychological dysfunction, didn't end with Freud. It became embedded in medical practice, legal systems, and social expectations in ways that persist today. Consider how this plays out in modern contexts. Women reporting physical pain are still more likely than men to be told their symptoms are psychosomatic. Women expressing anger are more likely to be labeled as emotionally unstable. Women's career ambitions are still sometimes pathologized as compensatory behavior for other inadequacies. The specific language has changed, but the underlying dynamic, where women's desires are subject to external interpretation and potential invalidation, remains remarkably consistent. The medical field provides particularly stark examples of how Freudian ideas about female psychology have had lasting negative effects. The concept of hysteria, which Freud helped popularize, led to countless women being dismissed when they sought help for real physical ailments. Conditions like endometriosis, autoimmune disorders, and heart disease in women went undiagnosed for decades, partly because of assumptions that women's health complaints were more likely to be psychological than physical. Even more troubling is how these ideas influenced the treatment of women who reported sexual abuse or assault. Freud's initial belief that his patients' reports of childhood sexual trauma were accurate was revolutionary. But when he later decided that these reports were actually fantasies born of repressed desire, he created a framework that made it easier to dismiss women's accounts of abuse. This shift in Freud's thinking had devastating consequences that extended far beyond his own practice. The concept of false memory syndrome, the questioning of women's testimony in legal proceedings, and the general skepticism toward women's reports of sexual violence all bear traces of this Freudian legacy. When women's desires and experiences are seen as inherently unreliable or subject to unconscious distortion, it becomes easier to dismiss their accounts when they conflict with social expectations or challenge powerful individuals. But the story of Freud and female desire isn't just about negative legacy. It's also about the remarkable resilience and creativity of the women who refuse to accept his characterizations of their psychology. These women, both within and outside the psychoanalytic movement, developed alternative frameworks for understanding female experience that were more nuanced and respectful of women's own perspectives. The feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s engaged directly with Freudian theory, both critiquing its limitations and reclaiming some of its insights. Writers like Betty Friedan in The Feminine Mystique directly challenged the idea that women's dissatisfaction with domestic roles was a sign of psychological maladjustment. Instead, she argued that such dissatisfaction was a healthy response to genuine limitations and unfulfilled potential. Meanwhile, within psychology itself, researchers began to develop new approaches to understanding female experience. Carol Gilligan's work on women's moral development challenged the assumption that women's different approaches to ethical reasoning represented immaturity rather than alternative frameworks. Nancy Chodorow's analysis of mothering and gender development provided new ways of understanding how gender identity forms without pathologizing female experience. Perhaps most importantly, the feminist movement insisted that women themselves should be the primary interpreters of their own experiences. This represents a fundamental challenge to the Freudian model where external authorities, typically male, claim superior insight into female psychology. The slogan, "The personal is political," captured the shift, arguing that women's individual experiences of dissatisfaction or desire often reflected broader social and political realities rather than personal psychological dysfunction. This evolution in thinking about female desire has had profound implications for therapy and mental health treatment. Modern psychotherapy increasingly emphasizes the importance of believing and validating clients' own accounts of their experiences. The therapeutic relationship is now understood as collaborative rather than hierarchical, with clients recognized as experts on their own lives rather than passive subjects of professional interpretation. However, the influence of Freudian thinking about female desire extends beyond formal psychology into popular culture and everyday relationships. The idea that female desire is more mysterious or complex than male desire persists in everything from dating advice to marriage counseling. The assumption that women don't really know what they want, or that their stated preferences should be interpreted rather than taken at face value, continues to shape how many people approach relationships. This has created a particularly insidious dynamic in romantic relationships where men sometimes feel justified in ignoring or overriding women's explicitly stated desires because they believe they understand women's real wants better than women themselves do. The pickup artist community, for example, has explicitly drawn on pseudo-Freudian ideas about female psychology to justify manipulative behavior. The dating and relationship advice industry is filled with content that treats female desire as a puzzle to be solved rather than a communication to be respected. Books with titles like What Women Want continue to be bestsellers, suggesting that the market for decoding female psychology remains strong. But the very premise of these books, that women's desires are so different from men's that they require special interpretation, reflects the continuing influence of Freudian assumptions. Even in more progressive circles, the legacy of Freudian thinking about female desire can be seen in the way women's sexuality is often treated as more complex or mysterious than men's. While it's true that research has revealed important differences in how sexuality is experienced across genders, the assumption that female sexuality is inherently more complicated or difficult to understand often reflects historical biases rather than scientific reality. The resolution of Freud's confusion about female desire, it turns out, was remarkably simple. Women want the same basic things that all humans want: respect, autonomy, fulfillment, love, and the freedom to pursue their own goals and express their own desires. The mystery wasn't in female psychology, it was in a social system that made it difficult for women to express these wants directly, and a theoretical framework that pathologized normal human desires when they appeared in female form. This realization has profound implications for how we understand desire more broadly. If Freud's confusion about female desire was really about his inability to see past the social constraints of his era, What other aspects of human psychology might we be misunderstanding because of our own cultural blind spots? How might future generations look back on our current psychological theories and wonder how we could have been so confused about what seems obvious to them? The story of Freud and female desire also highlights the importance of diverse perspectives in psychological research and theory development. The early psychoanalytic movement, dominated by men from similar cultural backgrounds, created theories that reflected their own experiences and assumptions. It wasn't until women and people from different cultural backgrounds became more prominent in psychology that these limitations became apparent. Today, psychology increasingly recognizes the importance of cultural competence and the need to understand how social context shapes psychological experience. The field has moved away from the idea that there are universal psychological truths that apply regardless of gender, culture, or historical context. Instead, there's growing recognition that psychological theories must be grounded in diverse experiences and perspectives to be truly useful. This shift has implications far beyond academic psychology. In therapy, education, medicine, and law, there's increasing recognition that treating people as individuals rather than as representatives of their gender, race, or other demographic categories leads to better outcomes. The assumption that certain groups are inherently mysterious or difficult to understand is being replaced by more nuanced approaches that recognize both individual differences and systemic influences. The most profound lesson from Freud's struggle with female desire might be about the importance of humility in the face of human complexity. Freud's willingness to admit his confusion was actually one of his most admirable qualities. It showed intellectual honesty and openness to the possibility that his theories were incomplete. The problem came when his followers treated his confusion as evidence of female mystery rather than as a limitation of his theoretical framework. Modern psychology has learned to be more suspicious of claims about fundamental differences between groups of people, especially when those claims seem to justify existing power structures. The field has developed better methods for studying human behavior that account for social context and cultural influences. Most importantly, there's growing recognition that the people being studied should be partners in the research process rather than passive subjects of professional interpretation. As we conclude this exploration of Freud's unsettling truth about female desire, it's worth reflecting on how these ideas continue to shape our world today. The next time you encounter claims about what women want or assumptions about female psychology being more mysterious than male psychology, remember Freud's honest admission of confusion. Ask yourself whether the mystery might be in the theoretical framework rather than in the people being studied. The story of Freud and female desire is ultimately a story about power, who gets to define reality, whose experiences are taken seriously, and whose desires are treated as legitimate. It's a reminder that psychological theories are not neutral scientific facts, but human constructions that reflect the perspectives and biases of their creators. Most importantly, it's a call to listen more carefully to people's own accounts of their experiences rather than imposing external interpretations that may serve our own comfort more than their understanding. What do you think about the lasting impact of these ideas on how we understand desire and gender today? Have you noticed ways that Freudian assumptions still influence how women's experiences are interpreted in your own life or in the culture around you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This conversation is too important to end here, and your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to understand their own experience better.